Welcome to this ACA Masters lesson. My name is Ben Roberts, and in this lesson, we'll be looking at the MI exam, specifically looking at costings. When looking at costings for the Management Information exam, the main thing we need to learn are the two types of costing method. That is absorption costing and marginal costing. Now, the two methods handle the types of cost a business may incur slightly differently. And it's this difference that underpins this topic area and underpins a lot of the exam questions that you're going to face on this area. Now, I think the best way to explain and walk through the two types of costing methods is to consider a fairly straightforward situation, being a manufacturing company that is producing a wooden table. Now, that manufacturing company, of course, is going to incur both variable and fixed costs. Now, I think the first thing we should just do is kind of walk through and consider the types of costs that the business will incur. So from a variable cost point of view, of course, when we buy our wood, we're going to incur the cost to create the product in the sense of the material cost. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that's £10 of wood that we need to use to make our table. Then, of course, we're going to have labor costs because we're presumably going to have a carpenter or someone that's going to kind of turn this wood into a table. And let's just say, again, for argument's sake, we're paying them £30 per table that they produce. Now, the final type of cost that could be incurred from a variable cost point of view would just be generic kind of variable overheads. Now, a good example of this would be potentially the electricity cost for the machinery that the carpenter is using. And let's just say that that was £5 per unit. Now, one really, really important thing about variable costs to learn and to understand is that per unit, they will remain constant. But as, of course, we make more units, our total variable cost will increase. So let's think about, again, a very simple example in the sense of here, our variable cost is £45 per table. Now, of course, if we make two tables, our total variable cost will then be £90. But of course, the underlying per unit cost has remained at £45. So it's a really, really important thing to learn and make sure you're comfortable with is that variable cost per unit will remain constant, but in total, as the unit number rises, the total variable cost will, of course, increase. Now, from a absorption versus marginal costing point of view, the variable cost is effectively the marginal cost. So one first big thing to kind of learn here is that marginal cost never handles fixed costs in the per unit cost of a product. So that's the first really crucial thing to learn here in terms of absorption versus marginal costing. Now, of course, under marginal costing, it's not the case that you haven't incurred the fixed cost. It's just that we've decided as a business that for us, we don't want to account for any of that fixed cost in our per unit cost. Instead, what happens under marginal costing with that fixed cost is it becomes what's known as a period cost. And that period cost is going to sit below cost of sales on our profit or loss. And it will basically be incurred in the period it relates to. And then that's effectively where the kind of story ends. If it's included in the per unit cost, and included as part of cost of sales, it could well be, ending up in closing inventory if the business has closing inventory in the end of that period, and therefore some of that fixed cost would then go into the next period as part of opening inventory. So that's the kind of the concept really when we say period cost under marginal cost. The cost is incurred in the period, and it just goes as a cost in that period. If you include things in the per unit cost, that's where things can then go into the next period via your cost of sales and your inventory. So the first really, really important thing, and I probably will say this a fair few times throughout this lesson, is marginal costing never has anything to do with fixed overheads in the per unit cost calculation. Now, of course, the alternative method is the absorption costing method. Now, again, one thing to kind of consider or think about is the variable cost, of course, is almost like the foundation of the absorption costing. It's almost like the default position for any costing method is your variable cost. And then all we're going to do for the absorption costing is come in and add a figure for the fixed overheads fixed production overheads that were incurred in the period. So that's the second thing to make sure you understand about absorption costing. Absorption costing does reflect the fixed overheads in the per unit cost. Now, one thing to just, I suppose, kind of clear up here is kind of like there's no set costing method that you must do in any given situation. Remember, this is the management information exam, which is for like internal reporting. So it's kind of like a decision of a business to go down the route of marginal costing or down the route of absorption costing. There's also no preferential or beneficial costing method as well. They'll all result in the same profit in the long run. Obviously, we will see, later on in this lesson how the maybe month by month profit may well differ under the two, but again, in the long run, there is no beneficial costing method to use. So in terms of the absorption costing and how, you're going to go about doing, in terms of getting some of that fixed cost into your per unit cost, again, if we go back to our fairly straightforward example of this furniture manufacturer making a table, I think a really nice example would be, a fixed cost here might well be their factory or their warehouse rent, or maybe their workshop rent. And of course, in terms of fixed costs, when we say fixed cost, by nature, it doesn't matter whether you produce kind of one table from your site or a million, for argument's sake, you're going to incur that fixed cost no matter what the production is. It's fixed. It's going to be incurred. Now, we haven't mentioned it yet so far, but this is probably a good opportunity to just mention a third type of cost. And I do want to kind of keep this example fairly straightforward, but it's definitely beneficial to mention this. And this type of cost is what's known as a stepped fixed cost. Now, what a stepped fixed cost is, and where this is quite nice to link you back to our example, is, of course, if we have our factory, workshop, or wherever we're producing our tables, there will be a production kind of capacity in that site. And potentially for us, the manufacturer of the tables, for us to kind of increase our business operations, it may well be the case that we actually need to go and open up a brand new site and incur a second rent cost. And therefore, in terms of if we want to hit a kind of particular production capacity, we might then need to open up that new site and therefore double our fixed costs. So one way of thinking about step fixed costs is they'll be fixed up, fixed costs will be fixed up until a point until they're, where we want to then increase capacity, and then the fixed costs will then increase. So you'll see this kind of in some of the MCQ questions, and also in the notes, there's kind of graphs to represent this where, as you then hit of that production capacity, your total fixed costs will increase because you're going to have to, in our example, open up this brand new site. Now, when we look at and we're talking about fixed costs in this situation, we're going to be just talking about those what I would class as kind of ordinary fixed costs, which is they're just fixed by nature. There's no kind of step fixed cost aspect to or anything like that. Now, of course, there are multiple different ways of actually kind of taking that fixed cost and absorbing, or another word to use would be like allocating the cost to the per unit cost. But the default position is to take your fixed cost and divide it by the number of units that you're anticipating or making. So let's kind of like put some numbers to this. So if we know that our kind of rent that we're expecting is £5,000 and our units that again we're expecting to make are 500, we'll keep the number simple, we would then allocate or absorb £10 per unit under the absorbed cost method. Now, this £10 that we've just calculated is what's known as the absorption rate. It's the cost per unit, the fixed cost per unit that we're going to absorb under the absorption costing method. And again, just to really reiterate this, the absorption rate is your budgeted fixed cost divided by, in this example, the budgeted units. And if you kind of reflect on it, like in terms of a very simplistic way of taking a fixed cost and allocating it to a per unit is to go, okay, well, my rent cost is 5,000. I'm expecting to make 500 units in the next period. So therefore I will just allocate per unit £10. Now, like I said, there is a whole range of different ways of absorbing your fixed overheads. And the key thing on exam day is to read the question. So if the question says, fixed costs are absorbed on labor hours, you need to make sure you follow that and you work out, the total labor hours, or it might be machine hours, or it might be a percentage of the variable cost, or it could well be anything, and you've just got to read that exam question. But a fair few of the exam questions, to be fair, do use this is almost like the default position, I suppose. So all that would then happen is you will just add that in, and then of course under the absorption costing you're going to have a higher cost per unit, because of course under the absorption costing you are using, or you are assigning, some of that fixed cost per unit. So the one thing I do just want to kind of clear up, or make sure that you have some understanding of, is why we use budgeted information here to arrive at our absorption rate. This often does confuse people. And I think the best way of putting it is, again, let's go back to this example of this manufacturer of the table. What we as the business can't do is kind of retrospectively go back to our customers and say, oh, by the way, the selling price that you need to pay us was this amount, because we've now worked out our costs based on what we kind of actually incurred. Of course, if we're setting up or we're running a manufacturing business, we need to know our expected costs at the start of any given period, so we can then work out our selling price, and we can hopefully therefore, make a profit or break even. So you always base your absorption rate based on budgeted information. That's a really, really kind of crucial thing to understand, particularly in the questions. Now, in terms of budgets, they are, even if you have the best budget in the world and the tightest controls and systems in place, your budget is, of course, highly likely, if not inevitably, going to be slightly different, if not very different, to what actually happens. Now, of course, the absorption costing method needs to address that, because we're using budgeted information here, and then, of course, the actuals are going to happen. So let's think of a situation that could well happen in terms of the month is now going to happen, and then we get our actual costs. So the rent actually was, let's say, for example, the landlord decided to put it up and it became 5,500, but we continue to produce our 500 units. What we will do is, because we have fixed our absorption rate at £10 per unit, we will continue to absorb the £10 per unit. So we'll absorb 500 units at £10, so we'll have an absorbed fixed production cost of 5,000. Now, of course, we can see that with the example I'm setting up, our actual cost was 5,500. Now, how this is kind of handled under the absorption costing method is, below your cost of sales, you will have an adjustment for what's known as the under or over absorbed cost. And what you're going to do here to correctly account for this in your exam questions is you're going to compare the cost absorbed versus the actual cost. And essentially, you will put a balancing number here to kind of true up or correct your profit or loss statement, so that the correct actual cost can be reflected. So of course here, if we have absorbed £5,000, but we know our actual rent cost is 5,500, we've quite clearly under-absorbed our cost, and therefore what we would do on a P&L is we would put in a figure to increase the costs for the period. Because if you didn't do this under or over absorption adjustment on your profit or loss statement for the absorption costing, the actual information you would be presenting would be incorrect. So that's a third thing to kind of take away from marginal absorption costing, is that under the absorption costing, because your absorption rate is set on budget data, it's inevitable, to be honest, in the exam questions, that the actual cost is going to be different from the budget, potentially, and therefore you would have an under or over absorption. So here again, just to recap, we will, because we've set it at the beginning of the period, we will continue to just absorb £10 per unit. We don't kind of retrospectively go back and change the per unit cost, because the actual is now different. So that's one way that an under or over absorption can arise, is if the actual cost is different to our budgeted cost. Now, the second situation that can arise is if the cost may well be the same, so 5,000, but the units may well be different. So let's say, for argument's sake, we had a really good month and we produced 600 units. Our cost of sales would now be 600 times by the 10. Now, of course, again, what are we going to do? We're going to compare the actual cost with the absorbed cost, and this time we've over-absorbed our fixed cost. So here we would put an adjustment of negative. We'd reduce the cost in our P&L to, again, true up the actual cost back to the actual cost incurred. So again, that's the second way that an under or over absorption could happen, is if the actual production units differ from your budget. So of course, if this was less, we would have, of course, 4,000, and then we would need to have a positive 1,000, because if the units fall below the budget, we would under absorb, and therefore we would need to increase our costs. So understanding the under or over absorption of your fixed production costs is a really important concept to understand and to feel confident working through, because again, you're going to potentially face some exam questions on this, particularly multiple choice questions where you may well calculate the right number, but you've got to be really clear on whether you've under or over absorbed. Now, one thing I haven't said so far, and I just, again, before we move on to some exam questions, just want to clarify, is that when we're talking about variable costs and fixed costs here, we are just talking about fixed production costs and variable production costs. So on exam questions, you will see fixed selling and variable selling. Now, one thing just to clarify is that selling costs will go down below as a period cost. They will not be incorporated into your per unit cost. So it's a really, really important point to understand and to learn. And you'll see as we go into those exam questions, but it's just something to make sure you never do in terms of taking any selling costs into this per unit cost calculation. So I think the thing we'll now do is move on and take a look at some exam questions on this topic area. So the scenario question we're going to take a look at is the scenario question where you are required to calculate a full profit or loss statement using both costing methods. So you're going to have one set of numbers for your absorption costing and one set of numbers for your marginal costing. And we can see here with the requirement, it says, calculate the profit or loss for February using absorption costing and marginal costing. Enter cost as negatives. Now, the key thing really to just check when you're reading the requirement is the time period you've been asked for, in the sense of this one just requires us for a singular month. Others you'll see in the question bank may require it for a quarter. That's just a really important thing to pick up on in the requirement. Also remember, enter cost as negatives. So of course, all of our costs here are going to be negatives, and then remember, closing inventory would be a positive number, going back to your cost of sales equation. So reading the question, we've got Windmill started business on the 1st of January, manufacturing a single product, the B77. The budgeted production cost per unit of B77 is as follows. So we've got variable materials, variable labor, and variable production overheads. So this is almost working one really that you need to set up, which is going to have a column for both costing methods to arrive at a per unit cost under the two methods. So of course we're going to have material, labor, variable overheads, and then of course for our absorption costing only, as we discussed, we're going to have a fixed overhead, whereas marginal costing we will not. So we've got the materials, which are going to be variable materials, 3 kilos at £12 per kilo. So 3 times 12, 36, and it's going to be the same for our marginal costing. Similarly with labour, we've got 3 hours at £20, so the total is going to be 60. Same for marginal costing. And then for the variable production overheads, we've got £35 per unit, and again, that's going to be the same under both. So remember, one way of, another sort of term that you could use for marginal costing is actually the variable cost per unit. Remember, the only difference between the two is that we do not factor in any fixed overheads into the per unit cost under marginal costing. Now, of course, for our absorption, we do need to have a quick calculation for what fixed overheads are going to be absorbed. And if we continue reading, we are given the information that will allow us to do that. So it says the budgeted production and sales for the first year is 5,000 B77s selling for a budgeted price of £450. Budgeted fixed production overheads are 200,000 per annum. And then it finally tells us that windmill absorbs fixed costs based on unit numbers. So what we can do in terms of working out our absorption rate, remember this is going to be the budgeted fixed costs divided by the budgeted units. We can come in and go, okay, well, I know that my fixed costs are 200,000 and my budgeted units are 5,000. So therefore, per unit of B77 that I make, I will absorb £40. Then I now have my two per unit costs. Now, this is a really important little working that you're going to need to have on exam day, and we will come back and refer to this working when we start populating some of these boxes. So if we continue reading, we get told the sale, admin and distribution costs, and that they are partly fixed and variable as follows. So of course, we'll kind of come back to these set of numbers when we populate these boxes. Now, up till now, we've kind of not really been given any information specifically about February or any information that allows us to really get in and populate any of these boxes. Where that information comes from is all in this chunk of text. So we can see here, we've got inventory the end of January was 120 B77s. Then goes on to say in February, we sold 439 B77s and manufactured 500. So again, the next working we just need to have, and it's going to be quite a quick working, but is to just work out how our inventory has moved in terms of the unit numbers. So we know we started the period with 120 B77s. We then made 500. We then sold 439, and the sales go in as a negative number here because we've sold them. These units have left the business, and then we can get our carry forward inventory, which of course they don't actually give us, but we can calculate this number. And then again, we will come back and use these numbers when we are populating our cost of sales box. That's a really important working to have there. So then finishing off this little section, it then says budgeted fixed costs are incurred evenly over the year. Actual costs were as budget except for variable selling, admin and distribution costs, which were 25% higher than budgeted. The actual selling price was 10% lower due to a promotional offer, and the fixed production overheads were 25,694. Now, it's a really important area of the information we're given, and in particular kind of importance is this bit where it says except for, because once you read that and then you see the except for, you know that these are the three things in this question that are different from your budget. Everything else was as per the budget. And it's a really, really important thing to pick up on exam day. So we've now got all of the information that's going to allow us to populate all of the numbers in this answer. So the first thing, let's start with the sales. In terms of, we were told that the actual selling price was 10% lower than the budget. So there's no different working under the two methods. Sales are the same under absorption and marginal. So what we can come in here and do is go, well, my budgeted price was 450. I know that this was sold at a 10% discount, so I can multiply that by 90% effectively, and then I can multiply it by the units sold, which was the 439. And then, like we said, that's going to be the same for both. So hopefully the sales would be a fairly straightforward box on exam day. Ultimately, it's not going to be worth that many marks, but it's important to get the easy marks. And the crucial thing really with the sales line is to pick up on, okay, what was the original budgeted price, and has that then changed when you move into the actual month? Then looking at our cost of sales, this is where our two workings here are going to become really, really handy, because in terms of the variable production cost, remember, like we said, that's another way of actually just saying the marginal cost. We can go, okay, well, I know that per the information we made 500, so therefore I'll multiply the 500 units made by the marginal cost, effectively the 131. And it's going to be the same for both columns. Both columns are going to show the same variable production costs. Now, where the cost of sales is then going to differ is, of course, the fixed production costs absorbed and also the inventory, because the inventory, as we can see, is being valued differently. And then also the fixed production costs absorbed, well, of course, for marginal, that is going to be a 0. It's really important to make sure you do that on exam day, because there are marks available for putting the 0 in the box. Now, in terms of the fixed production costs actually absorbed, again, it's going to be that 500 multiplied by the 40. So one thing to just clarify is, in terms of the variable production costs, fixed production costs, you will pick up the made number or the manufactured number. You do not pick up the sold number. That's one mistake that can be made quite easily, to think, okay, well, I'm just going to work out my production costs for the goods made, the goods sold in the year, so therefore I will take the production costs times by the units sold. But of course, we're interested in terms of the cost of sales, what did we actually make? And then in terms of the fact that we made more than we sold and inventory has changed, that's going to be reflected in the opening and closing inventory boxes. So really, really critical there in terms of variable production and fixed production costs, you're going to use the manufactured units. Then in terms of the opening and closing inventory, this is where, again, it just becomes like okay, well, my opening inventory under absorption was 120, and then my per unit cost under absorption was 177. And that needs to go in also as a negative number. And then in terms of the closing inventory, it's 181, again, multiplied by the 171. And it's the same principle for marginal cost, the 120, but now it's being multiplied by the 131. And of course, for the closing inventory, it's being multiplied by the 131 as well. So that's where we're going to, of course, have a difference in these numbers, is, like I said, the fixed production cost and then the inventory. And then in terms of our production cost of sales, we will then just total up these boxes. Now, in terms of the under or over absorption, this box really should be done in parallel with this fixed production cost line down here, because this fixed production cost, this is the period cost for the fixed production cost. And this is effectively under the marginal cost column. This is where we're going to just put the actual fixed production costs incurred in the period. Now, in this question, we were provided with that number, so that number can just go straight into this box here. But similar to the above row in terms of the fixed production costs absorbed, because under absorption you are absorbing the fixed production costs and they're included in part of your cost of sales, you wouldn't include a separate number in the fixed production costs. So here again, we're going to put a 0. And again, that's worth some marks. That's a really important thing to make sure you do. Now, the final piece that we need to do is to reflect the under or over absorption. So remember what we said in terms of under or over absorption, this arises out of two kind of scenarios, and often maybe a combination of both. One, the actual cost potentially was just higher than we expected, or two, the budgeted production information in terms of the units in this instance was different to what we actually ended up making. So if both of those two things are different to your budget in terms of the actual cost and the actual goods manufactured, then you're going to have a difference in terms of the fixed production costs absorbed and the actual fixed production cost that was incurred in the period. Now, what we do with this under or over box is we effectively compare the cost we absorbed to the actual cost in the period. And what you need to do to score well and effectively get the marks for this box is to compare this row, which is the actual cost, with your fixed production cost that you absorbed, and essentially you're going to put a balancing number in so that this box plus the under or over box agrees to this box. So of course here the figures are fairly nice. I can just do this in my head, but of course if we absorb 20 but the actual cost was 25,694, we've clearly under-absorbed because the cost is too low. So therefore, we need to put an additional cost in here, i.e. a negative number, so that when I do this box plus this box, it agrees to this box. And it's a really nice check you can do on exam day to make sure that you score well in those boxes. And then similarly for marginal cost, we will put a 0 in that box there. Now, once you've done that on a marginal and an absorption costing question like this, and you kind of got past all of that, you're then left with arguably a couple of easier rows in the answer. Kind of all the really hard work is done. We're now just down to variable selling and fixed selling. So again, remember back to the information we were told, the variable selling was 25% higher. So we know that from the information it was £5 per unit. So 5 times by 1.25 is £6.25. So what we then need to do is do the £6.25, and because this is a variable selling cost, we will take the units sold. And in this instance, there's no different approach for marginal or absorption. They're the same. The only difference between the two is when it comes to your cost of sales and the treatment of the fixed production costs. Finally, we've then got the fixed selling, admin and distribution costs, which there was no mention were different from the budget, but of course the information provided here was per year. So we just need to make sure that we do 120,000 divided by 12 because we're doing this for the month of February. Now, what we can then do, and it's a really nice thing on these questions, is you can total up this and you'd have to put all the numbers in on your calculator. But essentially, the difference in our profit will be the difference in our profit will be the movement in the inventory in terms of the number of units multiplied by the absorption rate. So this is the difference between our profit, and then we can just check that back in terms of my absorption rate was 40, and my change in inventory levels was, well, it started at 120 and it went to 181. So we've got 40 multiplied by the 61, and that gets us to the same number. Now, again, if that happens on exam day, you know that you've basically done things correctly on the question. Because again, think back to what we've discussed a few times. The only thing that's different between the two is the treatment of fixed overheads in the per unit cost of our inventory. And therefore, that is the only difference that should be reflected in the bottom line profit or loss for the period. So it's a really nice check you can do on exam day, because if you do get into this situation where the movement, the difference in the profit agrees to the movement in the inventory, you pretty much know you've done very, very well on the question. And it's certainly something to do, because if you arrive at a slight difference here, it's an opportunity to go and check some things in your answer to make sure that these are the same in both. For example, you haven't got like a positive number where it should be a negative number, and maybe your fixed production cost and the under or over absorption and the absorbed cost is all correct as well. It's just a really good check you can do on exam day to make sure that you're getting the correct the correct numbers in the boxes before you move on to the next question. So the next question we'll look at is a similar style of scenario question, in the sense that we need to calculate a profit or loss under the two different methods. The only difference is there's just a slight difference in terms of the wording of the question, which we'll work through together. Again, though, if we start at the requirement, we've got calculate the profit or loss and this time it's for the quarter, April to June, using both absorption costing and marginal costing. Enter costs as negative values again. So going up to the top, we've got Cloud Limited has been trading for many years, manufacturing a single product, the Mini C. The budget for the next quarter has been prepared, and it shows the following production cost information per Mini C. This time we've got variable materials, variable labor, variable production overheads, and we've got our various numbers, but this time slightly differently. We've actually been provided with the fixed production overheads that have been absorbed to the per unit cost. So in terms of when we come to do our working one, our absorption costing per unit compared to our marginal cost per unit, when we collate our materials, our labor, and our variable overheads, we've already got our fixed overheads. So in this instance, it's £4, £10.50, and £6. And then we know, like we said, this is going to be the same for marginal costing, and then that's where things will stop for marginal costing. So the per unit cost for marginal costing is £20.50. The only difference for absorption costing is we're going to include that fixed overhead absorbed. Then moving on, it tells us that the budgeted sales and production for the year are equal to 6,000 units at a budgeted selling price of £42 per mini C. And then we've again got our information about selling, admin and distribution costs being partly fixed and partly variable as follows. So 12,000 per quarter and £2 per unit. Then again, this mini section is going to allow us to actually populate all of our pro forma boxes. So this one tells us that inventory at the end of March was 220. So again, in terms of our inventory working, we've got our brought forward inventory, which is 220. And then it goes on to tell us in the quarter, April to June, Cloud Limited sold 1,525 mini Cs, and we manufactured 1,478 who got made and sold again. So we've got 1,478 and we sold 1,525. Then that allows us to work out our carry forward inventory. And again, this is in terms of units or closing inventory in terms of units. And again, just like the last question, we will come back and use both of these workings to pick up the relevant numbers for the relevant boxes. Then it goes on to tell us the budgeted fixed costs are incurred evenly over the year, and then the actual cost and selling price were as budget, except for fixed selling, admin and distribution costs, which were 15% higher than budgeted. So really important, I just want to flag this, is that the question wording is subtly different to the previous question. In the previous question, we had a nice kind of neat figure down here for the actual fixed production costs in the period, and then that was quite a nice process to go, okay, well, what do I do under the two methods? Well, under marginal costing, I take my actual fixed production costs and I use them as a period, and I count for them as a period cost down here. So I will just plug that number given into this box down here. Now, when you first read this question, it would appear potentially that they're missing something, or it's it's near impossible to answer because you haven't been given that actual fixed production cost. But very importantly, you have, and this comes back down to the point I was reiterating in the previous question, which is that if you really focus in on what follows the except for, you'll see that there's no mention about fixed production costs after the except for. So therefore, you know that actual costs, well, the actual costs for our fixed production costs were the same as budget. And that's a really important thing to make sure you understand, and in terms of the wording of the question, because then once you've made that conclusion, you can then take that and go back to your information up here and work out your budgeted fixed costs. And therefore, by doing that, you have also worked out your actual fixed costs. Now, in terms of how we do that, again, quick recap, the absorption rate formula is the budgeted fixed cost divided by the budgeted units. And in this instance, we know the £5 will equal the fixed cost, which we're after, but we were given the budgeted units, which was 6,000. So therefore, if we just quickly rearrange that formula to be 5 times by 6,000, we've got our fixed costs. Now, this is the fixed costs per year. We're doing a quarter. So the final step is to then just divide that by 4. Now that in itself, I think it's one of those kind of classic things, I suppose, maybe in hindsight, it's one of those that, okay, yeah, you can see that that's how you do it. But when you first read that question, it's quite difficult to arrive at that conclusion. Now, once we've got this number, this question now becomes exactly kind of the same as the previous question that we just looked at, albeit with just different numbers. So again, what we can start doing is populating this from the top down. So we know that, again, actual cost and selling price was budget. So we can get our selling price, which is £42, and we can multiply that 42 by the number of units sold, which was 1,525. And it's the same for marginal costing. We can then go, okay, well, variable production costs. Okay, well, the marginal cost is £20 50p. So we can take our made number, the 1,478, multiply that by the £20.50. And again, that's going to be the same for both. We can then do our fixed production costs absorbed, because we know that our absorption rate was 5, and we know again that we made 1,780. And again, we know that under marginal cost, there'll be a 0 in that box. And then finally, in terms of the opening and closing inventory, it's again just getting the right number from the right place in your working. So absorption costing is going to be the 220 multiplied by the £25.50. Under marginal costing, it's going to be the 220 times by the £20.50. And the closing inventory is going to be the 173 multiplied by the £25.50 under absorption, and the 173 times by the £20.50. So again, just reiterate the point, closing inventory goes in as a positive number because it reduces our cost of sales. And again, we can sum up those two sections to get our production cost of sales. Now from there, we move on to the under or over absorption. So the first thing we can do, we have already calculated it, is put the actual fixed production cost in the period, which came from this working here. Remember to put our 0 in here. And then in terms of the under or over, again, it's that kind of comparison. Okay, well, I absorbed 7,390. My actual cost was 7,500. So the number I need to plug into this box is going to be a further cost of 110, because I've under absorbed my costs in my cost of sales. And again, we can put a 0 in here. So it's a really nice check to do on exam day in terms of these three rows, is that plus that should agree to that. And that's a really important check to do. Once you've done that, we're just left to, again, maybe slightly easier numbers on this answer, in the sense of, that they're not going to be massively high scoring, but you still need to pay attention to it and make sure you don't kind of make silly mistakes to throw away easy marks. So again, potentially by now on exam day, you might need to just recap yourself in terms of, okay, what was the except for? Well, this time it was the fixed selling. So the variable selling was the same as budget. So here again, their selling cost. So it's going to be the 2 times by the unit sold. So 1,525. And again, it's going to be the same for marginal costing. Then we get told that the fixed selling, admin and distribution were 15% higher. So of course we were given that it was 12,000 per quarter. Remember, we are doing a profit or loss for the quarter. So we can simply just take the 12,000, multiply it by 1.15, i.e. increase it by the 15%, and then we can arrive at our right answer. The final step then is to total up your profits under the two methods and do your final check, which is, okay, well, the difference in my profit should agree back to my change in inventory multiplied by my absorption rate. So our absorption rate in this question was 5. The change in inventory was 220 less 173, and therefore that multiplied by that gets us back to the same number. So therefore we know that our answer is all but correct. Obviously, you can never be 100% sure on exam day, but that's as good as you're ever going to get under exam conditions, that you've got everything spot on. And again, just as a recap, it's changing inventory in terms of the units. So, the brought forward take, the carry forward, that's where that 47 comes from. So I think with a bit of practice, these absorption versus marginal costing profit or loss questions can become, you can become quite slick at them and quite quick at them, particularly if you set up your workings and get comfortable grabbing the numbers from the right place. And I think the other big takeaway from the two questions we've just done there is really remembering that the difference between profits will always originate from the change in inventory multiplied by the absorption rate. That's very applicable to lots of multiple choice questions that you can see on this topic area.